Would you believe? A newborn Bigfoot was once saved by humans. Not in legend, but right here in Minnesota in 1989. He wasn't an animal. He shielded his eyes from the light. He reached out to hold the hand that saved him. The truth few dare to believe is this: Bigfoot doesn't hide from us. They choose silence, and they follow an ancient rule of the forest. When a human saves a life, it must be returned through letting go. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a sacred exchange. This story comes from the man who saved him, Walt Crowley, and a local veterinarian who watched the impossible unfold. There are footprints, drawings, photos, and moments no one has ever seen before. In this video, you'll discover why Bigfoot might not be violent at all, the chilling but beautiful law of return, and the most heart-shaking moment, when a creature of myth learned to say thank you like a child. His name was Kip. He was found trembling under ice. He drew pictures in the mud. Every sunset he turned to the forest, listening for his kind. And one day, he walked away, alone. The forest had come to take its child home. And now, dear viewer, where in the world are you watching from? What name should we greet you with today? Because stories like Kip's deserve to be remembered, shared, and protected. How far can this story travel? With your help. If this touched something in you, consider liking this video and subscribing. Let's build a gentle, curious, and respectful community for those who still believe in Bigfoot, in mystery, and in second chances. We see you, and we're glad you're here. It was the kind of morning that stayed quiet even after the sun came up. Moose Lake stretched wide beneath a fading veil of fog, its thin coat of ice catching the dim light like old glass. The kind of ice that hadn't quite decided whether to hold or surrender. All around it, the forest stood frozen in a breath. Bare birch limbs rattled faintly in the cold, and somewhere distant, a crow let out a single, reluctant cry before falling silent again. Walt Crowley stood alone at the shoreline, 58 years old and long past the part of life where noise felt necessary. He looked like he belonged there, layered in his patched canvas jacket, gloves too stiff to bend, beard salted white. His breath came in slow clouds as he checked the line from his rod, the metal reel creaking faintly when turned. This wasn't fishing for the sake of catching. Not anymore. It was how he stayed part of the world without having to speak to it. The lake cracked softly under itself. Not the sound of breaking, just the whisper of tension. Walt's eyes tracked the surface as something interrupted the mirror of ice. A ripple? No. A distortion, about 30 feet out from the edge. He narrowed his eyes. There, beneath the frost glass top, something unmoving, curved and shadowed. But not fish, not log. Something too still. He took a step closer, then another. At first he thought it might be debris, until he saw the rise and fall. Barely perceptible, a faint pulse of motion in the center of a shape. Breathing. He dropped the rod. The cold didn't matter now. He stepped onto the ice, slow and heavy, boots pressing into the crust. It groaned beneath him. Each step announced itself to the silence. He'd walked this lake his whole life. He knew what would hold. He also knew he was past that point already. The shape came into focus. Small, curled, half submerged in the slush under the crust. Dark hair frozen to the surface. An arm twisted oddly beneath it. Its chest rose again, a trembling shudder. Then still. A child? No, not human, but not anything else he could name. He crouched. The ice creaked like a warning shot. There was a moment. A line drawn in frost. He could have gone back. Instead, he brought down the heel of his boot. The ice shattered under his weight. Water surged over the break, black and instant. Walt dropped to his knees, plunging his gloved hands into the freezing lake. His body flared in pain, nerves screaming. The cold was a bite, then a burn, then nothing at all. He felt the fur first, matted and stiff. Then skin beneath, softer than he expected. He hauled the small body toward him, water clinging like oil. It was heavy in that strange way things are when they don't help you. His gloves tore, one hand sliced open. He didn't stop. When he finally collapsed backward onto the shore, the thing lay across his lap, soaked and still, not breathing now. He pressed 2 fingers under what he thought might be a jawline. A flutter, shallow and defiant. The face was turned away, but the features visible looked almost mournful. Barely any fur across the cheeks. Eyes closed. Lips faintly parted. The breath came in soft, uneven whimpers. Walt didn't speak. He just held it tighter. A wind moved through the trees like someone inhaling, and then he saw it, on the left wrist of the being. Faint marks. A ring of skin rubbed clean, as if something soft had once been tied there and worn away over time. Not wild, not random, not abandoned. He turned his head, suddenly alert. The snow near the bank was muddied, thick with churned earth and broken reeds, but no sign of a chase, no scuffle. Just tracks, wide, deep, bare footprints larger than any boot. One said. They circled the lake. They never went far. Whoever made them had stood watch. Walt rose, still cradling the creature, arms trembling now from more than cold. The forest behind him waited in stillness, and then he saw it, across the lake, just past the edge of the tree line. A figure, tall, still, unmoving, its shape blurred by fog and distance, but unmistakable. It did not come closer. It did not threaten. It simply stood, watching. Walt didn't call out. He didn't wave. He didn't dare breathe too loud. He looked down again. The child in his arms, because it was a child somehow, despite what his eyes couldn't categorize, breathed in a ragged, shallow gasp, the kind that begged to be heard. And there, on the broken edge of the ice where he'd pulled it free, something caught the light. A handprint, massive, set deliberately in slush and snow, as if someone had knelt there, as if they'd pressed their hand into the lake's skin with purpose, not to break, not to chase, just to mark, like a prayer or a goodbye. Walt lowered himself slowly, kneeling on dry ground, cradling the small being closer to his chest. Its breath shivered against his collarbone, and in a voice low enough that even the trees had to lean in, he whispered, "I know. It wasn't a rescue. It was a trade." The ride home was quiet. Walt didn't use the truck heater. The old Ford rattled enough without it, and part of him figured the body against his chest needed to feel that chill a little longer, like fading out of one world before stepping into another. Back in town, the morning had started to wake. Smoke from chimneys, a school bus turning. No one saw him park behind the old rescue cabin, tucked at the end of a snow-slushed track no one plowed unless they had a reason. He got out with the bundle wrapped in his canvas coat. The door opened before he could knock. Maggie Sutter stood there in thick socks and a faded sweater, sleeves pushed to the elbows. Her dark hair was pulled back in a hasty braid, her hands already halfway into medical gloves. She didn't ask questions. She didn't blink. Walt stepped inside. The old ranger's rescue post had been converted years ago. Now it was more sanctuary than station. A cot, a generator, some emergency supplies. Maggie took the child, no, the creature, gently from his arms and carried it like a newborn toward the heated table. "Get back," she said, her voice flat but not unkind. "Don't let it know you're sent." He obeyed. Steam rose from warm cloths. Maggie moved with the quiet speed of someone who'd once been a battlefield nurse and forgot how to panic. She worked without words, heating saline, checking vitals, placing a finger near the throat to count faint pulses. Then came the blankets, the breathing mask, the warm milk thinned with water, administered in slow drops through the corner of the mouth. She didn't ask Walt where it came from. Only when she was sure it would live, if only for a few more hours, did she glance back at him. Walt's hand bled. She didn't mention it. He turned away from the table, took a single breath, and felt it catch halfway. There, in the shadow of the window, snow drifted against the glass. Outside, something had passed. Not a sound, not a knock, but the faintest movement in the way the pine straightened again, as if someone had just walked away. Maggie looked down at the small body, now curled slightly on its side beneath the heat lamp. Its foot twitched, not randomly, reflexively. She knelt to adjust the towel near its face, and froze. The sole of its foot was worn, skin calloused and thick from travel. This wasn't a creature born weak. It was strong once. It had lived, had been taught. As she reached to adjust the lamp, the light brushed across its eyes. They opened, dark, reflective, but not afraid. They blinked, and the small hand reached up, not to fight, not to run, just to find something. Its fingers wrapped around Maggie's own. No force, no claws, just contact. She turned quickly, as if brushing something from her cheek. But it wasn't the heat. She didn't let go. Outside, the wind had shifted. A smell of pine and old ash, of snow about to fall again. And somewhere beneath that, something older, something watching. The prints by the lake would vanish before midday. But one thing would remain. An old handprint on broken ice, frozen in place, untouched by sun or time. Walt stood near the door, head bowed slightly, not in prayer, but in understanding. This wasn't something they'd found. It was something they had been chosen to carry, and even if they didn't yet know what law had been written beneath the surface of that lake, they had already broken it. The road to the wildlife station was never meant to be found by accident. It curled away from the main highway like a thought you weren't supposed to finish, narrowing into packed snow and frozen mud, bordered by pines that leaned inward as if they'd agreed to keep secrets. Walt drove slow, one hand on the wheel, the other steadying the old blanket on the seat beside him. The engine rattled in a tired, familiar way. It was still early, but the sky had shifted, that pale Minnesota gray that promised more cold before warmth ever dared to arrive. The small body beneath the blanket barely moved now. Not stillness, not death, just the fragile pause of something holding on by instinct alone. The station came into view at the very end of the road. A squat, weather-beaten building with a slanted roof heavy with old snow. No sign, no lights on the outside, just a single narrow window glowing faintly yellow, like someone had been awake all night waiting for a reason to stay that way. Walt cut the engine. The silence pressed in immediately. He sat for a moment, listening. To the wind brushing the trees, to his own breath, to the thin, uneven sound coming from the bundle beside him. Then he opened the door and lifted the small weight into his arms again. It felt lighter than it should have. That scared him more than the cold ever had. The door opened before he knocked. Maggie Sutter stood there barefoot in thick wool socks, a faded flannel hanging loose over a thermal shirt. Her hair was pulled back in a messy braid, dark strands escaping around her face. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her eyes moved first to the blanket, then to Walt's face. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Too long," he said. She stepped aside. Inside, the station smelled faintly of antiseptic and old wood. A single overhead light hummed. There was no modern equipment here, no polished counters. Just a sturdy table in the center, a portable incubator unit salvaged years ago, stacks of towels warmed by a space heater, and shelves lined with handwritten labels. Maggie took the bundle from Walt with a gentleness that came from practice, not hesitation. She laid it down and peeled the blanket back inch by inch. The small body shivered when exposed to the warmer air, a weak tremor running through it. Maggie's hands were already moving. She checked the mouth first, clearing ice crystals from the lips, then the chest, then the temperature, pressing 2 fingers against the neck, her eyes closing briefly as she counted. Her jaw tightened. Hypothermia. Severe. The kind that erased time and memory alike. "Stand back," she said. Not unkind. Final. Walt stepped away, his boots leaving wet prints on the floor. He felt useless suddenly. His hands shook now that they had nothing to do. Maggie worked without asking questions. She cut away the frozen remnants of the coat, replaced it with warm towels, slid the small body gently into the incubator. She adjusted the heat in increments, careful not to shock the system. Slow warmth, slow breath, slow return. She mixed a thin solution of milk and electrolytes, tested the temperature on her wrist, then dipped a cloth and let a few drops touch the corner of the mouth. Not forceful. Never forceful. The lips parted slightly. A breath caught. Another followed. Walt exhaled without realizing he'd been holding it. Maggie glanced at him then, just once. "If it lives," she said softly, "you don't touch it again. Not yet. It can't learn your smell. Can't think this place is where it belongs." He nodded. She turned back to her work. Minutes passed. Then more. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Somewhere deep in the building, the generator kicked on, a low, steady thrum filling the space. The small being stirred, not in panic, not thrashing. Just a slow, cautious movement, like waking from a long, cold sleep and testing whether the world was still there. Its fingers curled slightly. Its toes flexed. Maggie leaned closer. The light brushed across its face, and Walt saw it more clearly now. The shape of the brow, the soft curve of the nose, the eyes opening halfway, dark and reflective, taking in light without fear. There was intelligence there. Not learned, not taught. Something older. Maggie noticed something then and stilled. She lifted one foot gently, turning it toward the light. The sole was thickened, calloused, worn in patterns that didn't come from sickness or weakness. This was a child that had traveled, that had climbed, that had walked on stone and bark and frozen earth. "This one wasn't born fragile," she murmured, mostly to herself. The being flinched slightly when the overhead light brightened, raising one arm, not to strike, not to shield the body, but to cover its face. A reflex, a social one. Maggie froze again. She had seen this before. In orphaned animals raised too close to humans. In children pulled from places where noise meant danger. This wasn't instinct alone. It was awareness. Outside, a sound brushed the wall of the station. Not a knock, not a scrape. Just the faint disturbance of snow shifting where it hadn't been touched moments before. Walt felt it before he understood it. Maggie didn't look up. She reached out slowly, and the small hand reached back. Fingers wrapped around her index finger with surprising gentleness. No claws, no tension, just contact. Her breath caught. She turned her face away, pretending to check the temperature dial. But Walt saw the way her shoulders tightened, the way she blinked too fast. She hadn't let herself feel this in a long time. Years ago, before the paperwork and the rules and the careful distance, Maggie had believed that saving something meant it stayed saved. That care equaled belonging. That belief had cost her more than she ever admitted out loud. Outside, the wind shifted again. Maggie finished stabilizing the incubator and stepped back. "It's awake," she said. "That doesn't mean it's safe." Walt nodded. He moved closer to the window instead of the table, keeping his promise. Frost traced the edges of the glass. Beyond it, the forest stood dark and dense, and then he saw them. Marks, fresh and deliberate, carved into the trunk of a pine just beyond the clearing. 3 long vertical scratches, evenly spaced. Too high for any animal he knew. Too clean to be chance. A boundary. Not a warning, a statement. He swallowed. Maggie followed his gaze. Her expression didn't change, but something settled behind her eyes. Understanding, not fear. "They know where it is," she said quietly. "Yes," Walt answered. "They always did." The small being shifted again, releasing Maggie's finger slowly, as if testing whether the connection would hold without grip. Its eyes followed movement in the room, observing, remembering. Maggie covered it again, dimmed the light slightly and let the room breathe. For a long moment, no one spoke. Outside, something moved through the trees, Not rushing, not hiding, just passing. The snow road leading to the station would fill in again by morning. Tracks erased. Evidence softened. Inside, the incubator hummed steadily. Maggie leaned back against the counter, arms crossed loosely, staring at nothing in particular. "I used to think," she said finally, "that if you saved something, it became yours to protect forever." Walt didn't respond. He knew better than to interrupt a truth finding its way out. She looked at the small shape under the warm light, at the steady rise and fall of its chest. "Turns out," she went on, quieter now, "that sometimes saving means knowing when to let go." The being shifted again, eyes fluttering open, and for a brief moment, it looked not at Maggie, not at Walt, but toward the wall, toward the forest beyond it, as if listening. A faint sound answered from somewhere far off, too low to be a howl, too patterned to be the wind. Walt felt it in his bones. Whatever had been set in motion at the edge of Moose Lake had not ended here. This place was only the pause between breaths, and outside, the forest was waiting. The rumors didn't take long to find their way through town. In a place like Moose Lake, where folks still picked up their mail in person and left handwritten notices pinned to the corkboard in front of the post office, information didn't spread. It seeped, quietly, like cold through old floorboards. It started with a kid who swore he saw headlights by the old Ranger Road around midnight. Then came the waitress who said she overheard something strange on the radio. Static, followed by a sound that didn't belong to any wildlife she knew. And then somebody mentioned Maggie Sutter's name and things got quieter, because Maggie didn't stir gossip. She stopped it, but still something had shifted. At the center of it all, the station sat frozen in place like it had always been. Maggie kept the generator running. Walt dropped by twice a day without saying much. And inside the incubator, the small being, who now had the temporary name Kip on the intake chart, was beginning to breathe without help. They hadn't discussed a name, but the chart needed a label, and specimen made Maggie's stomach turn. So Kip it was. Outside, the snow kept falling, lighter now, but steady. Inside, Kip was watching, not passively, not like a newborn. He tracked motion with his eyes. He noticed light, shadows, the rise and fall of Maggie's voice when she gave updates aloud. Though she stopped doing that after the third time he turned his head in her direction. She didn't need the reminder that this was no ordinary creature. She already knew. But it was different when you felt it staring back. And then came the knock. Not on the door, on the radio. The old base unit on the wall clicked to life in a burst of static. Maggie crossed the room and answered with a flat tone. "Station 3. A pause, then a familiar voice, crisp and official. "Ranger Vance, you available for a quick visit?" She glanced toward the cot. Kip was curled beneath a wool blanket, back turned. Walt looked up from his seat in the corner. Maggie didn't ask why. She just said yes. Colton Vance showed up less than an hour later, dust from the road still clinging to the truck he didn't bother to wash. He stepped inside with his usual posture, back straight, boots clean, clipboard in hand even when he didn't need it. He was 36 and carried himself like a man who knew which line not to cross, but also believed he'd never have to. Logical, controlled. Sometimes that made him helpful. Sometimes it made him dangerous. Right behind him came Anya Meireles, 29, lean, sharp-eyed and quiet in the way people are when they've learned the woods don't reward loud thinkers. She wore her badge like a tool, not a symbol. Of the two, Maggie trusted her more. "What have you got?" Colton asked, eyes already scanning the room. Maggie didn't answer right away. She led them to the cot without preamble, letting them see for themselves. Kip didn't flinch. He opened his eyes, calm and slow, and looked at them the same way he'd looked at Maggie the day before. Not afraid, just aware. Curious even. Anya crouched down slightly, not too close. "God," she whispered, more breath than word. "It's young." "Male?" Colton asked. "We don't know," Maggie said, "and we're not poking around to find out." Colton frowned. "And where exactly did it come from?" Walt's voice came from behind them. The lake. He didn't elaborate. Anya stood back up, her gaze still locked on Kip. You didn't find this. You were given it. Maggie said nothing. Walt's silence deepened. Colton exhaled, jotting something down on the clipboard. Then he paused. We can't keep it here. Not like this. No chain of custody. No containment procedures. Hell, this station doesn't even have internal security. We're not caging him, Maggie said flatly. It's not about cages, Colton replied. It's about process, about who gets to decide what's protected and what's reported. Walt moved between them then, not fast, not aggressive, just steady. Like a man who's seen enough of the world go sideways to know when it's starting again. I think you should slow down, he said. Colton didn't step back. Anya did. She moved toward the window, something drawing her there. She squinted out into the trees, then stepped outside without a word. Cold air blew in briefly before the door shut behind her. Maggie turned to Colton. You want to document him? Fine. Write your report. But if you try to move him, you'll have to explain what that means to every soul who's been living in this forest long before we put fences around it. Colton opened his mouth to argue. Then the radio hissed. Everyone turned. Not static this time. A sound. A soft rhythmic series of low tones. Faint, distant, but too regular to be interference. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. Walt stepped closer. That's coming from outside. Colton went for his coat. Maggie stayed still. Then Kip sat up. No sound, no panic. He just sat up straight, head tilted toward the radio like he was listening to something only he could hear clearly. His mouth opened just a little. A sound came out. Not quite a word. Not quite a call. And from the woods beyond the station, a matching pattern answered. Not louder, not closer, but real. Colton froze. Anya opened the door again, her face pale. There's something out there. No one moved. Walt crossed the room to the counter and lifted a small canvas pouch. From inside, he pulled a stone, black, smooth, heavy as a fist. He'd found it tucked in the back of his truck that morning. Too clean, too placed. A message. He set it on the table. Anya stepped forward and picked it up. Turned it. Ran her thumb along the edge. There was a shallow groove carved down the middle. Not random, not natural. A channel. It's a marker, she said quietly. They know. Colton looked between them all. So what? You think they're watching? They're not watching, Walt said. They're waiting. A silence followed that no one tried to break. Colton moved to the door but didn't open it. He looked back at Kip. We can't keep him here. He doesn't belong to us, Maggie said. Anya nodded slowly. No, she said. But they left him with us, which means they're testing something. Walt's voice dropped low. They're giving us a choice. Kip lay back down, eyes closing again. Calm, like a child who knew the room would hold. Outside, the wind shifted. The forest didn't move, but somehow it felt nearer. And from that moment on, Walt Crowley understood that he wasn't on the outside of this story anymore. He was right in the middle of it, and every step forward would matter. The old ranger outpost had a name on the official paperwork, Station 3, but no one called it that anymore. Locals called it the End House, not because it sat at the end of the snow road, but because it was where things often came when they had nowhere else to go. A busted wing owl. A half-starved lynx once. A boy once too, years ago, hiding under the porch in a blizzard. But Maggie didn't talk about that. Now there was Kip. 3 days had passed since the rhythm from the forest had answered him. Since he'd sat up under his own strength and tilted his head toward the window like he remembered something his body hadn't caught up to yet. The incubator was no longer needed. Maggie left the top open, then eventually took it apart and folded the frame away. Kip now slept on a makeshift bed of thermal blankets and flannel layers beside the wood stove, the soft red-orange light painting the outline of his limbs each night. His breathing was steady. His eyes no longer fluttered when the wind moved through the trees. And every evening, right around the same time, he would stand. He would walk to the back door, not the front, and he would face the trees in the exact same direction. Never called, never prodded, just stood, as if there was something out there waiting for him that hadn't come yet. Maggie didn't interrupt those moments. She watched from the kitchen, dish towel still in her hands, heart heavy with something she didn't have the right words for. It wasn't worry. Not exactly. It was more like recognition. That kind of low ache when you realize something doesn't belong to you, even though it let you hold it for a while. Kip was healing, but he wasn't adjusting. He wasn't trying to mimic the humans around him. He wasn't looking for food like a stray dog might. He wasn't learning them. He was remembering himself. He moved with caution, but not confusion. When Maggie left a bucket of water near the fireplace, he didn't stare blankly at it. He scooped from it with cupped hands and wiped his face as if he'd done it 1,000 times before. When Walt brought in wood, Kip didn't flinch at the axe on his hip. He stared at the shape of it, then turned away, unimpressed. Nothing about him said, newborn. Everything said, displaced. Walt came by every morning just after sunrise. He rarely spoke unless Maggie needed something. Kip didn't avoid him, but he didn't approach either. The distance between them was some quiet, invisible agreement. Until the lock. It happened during a soft thunderstorm that rolled in from the west. One of those early summer ones that didn't flash with anger but grumbled like an old man complaining under his breath. The power blinked out around dusk. Maggie lit 3 oil lamps without thinking, her body moving from muscle memory. Walt was just about to leave when the side door creaked. Not from the wind. From Kip. The door had been bolted. Kip stood at it now, his back to them. He reached for the latch, fingers hovering. He didn't look at it long. Just once. Then pulled the bolt sideways in one clean motion and slid the door open into the storm. Rain flicked in sideways, but he didn't step out. He just listened. The woods didn't answer. After a moment, Kip closed the door again. Latched it. Walt looked at Maggie. She didn't speak. That night, she sat with her journal open on the counter but never wrote a word. She just stared at the last line she'd written the day before. If he's learning, he's not learning from us. Because the truth was harder. He wasn't learning. He was remembering. The next day, they tested a theory. They scattered small food items, berries, nuts, smoked venison, in a loose path across the edge of the clearing behind the house. Kip ignored them. But that evening, when the clouds had cleared and the moon rose sharp and low, he walked straight to the last point on the trail and knelt beside a bent sapling. He placed both hands on the dirt, then stood again. The prints he left behind were shallow but deliberate. Not from accident, from intent. Later, Walt marked that spot with a branch. The next morning, it had been turned 90 degrees, pointing into the thicker trees. Kip didn't touch it, but he looked at it as he passed. There were new signs, too. Trees with bark peeled upward in strips, not down. Stumps carved with triangular notches. A line of flat stones running from the back fence into the first shadow of the woods. Anya came by that afternoon. She stood near the tree line for a long time without speaking. When she finally stepped inside, she said only, "They're still watching, they just aren't in a hurry." Maggie nodded. That night Kip drew, not on paper, not with tools. He found a patch of dry floor near the hearth and dipped 2 fingers into the ashes at the bottom of the firebox. Then he knelt and began to mark. Slow strokes, curved lines, then shapes. At first it looked like a child's sketch, but then Maggie saw it. A large figure bent low, arms curled around something smaller. A forest behind them. Circles drawn high above, and something else. 3 vertical lines at the bottom, etched deep. Kip stepped back, looked at it once, then wiped it away with his forearm and went to sleep. Maggie didn't. She stared at that floor long after the coals had gone dull. She understood. He wasn't drawing what he wanted. He was remembering what he lost. In the following days, Kip's routine became sharper. He would eat at the same hour, sleep at the same hour. But each dusk, he would sit by the window, never closer than a foot, always with his hands pressed on his knees, back straight, eyes fixed east into the trees. He never moved until the last light slipped behind the ridgeline. Then he would lie down, arms crossed over his chest like he was holding something invisible. Maggie began to sense it first, a pull at her chest, a flicker of wrongness. Not that Kip was getting worse. The opposite. He was recovering too well. This place, these people, the quiet comfort of blankets and warm milk and soft lamps. They weren't a gift to him. They were a delay, a pause. She remembered a story her mother told once about keeping a baby bird too long, about how holding something fragile sometimes made it forget how to fly. She stood outside alone on the fifth evening, jacket half zipped, watching Kip through the window. He wasn't moving, just sitting in that same stillness. She felt the wind brush her neck, then still. She knew it then. Keeping him was beginning to hurt more than it helped. Inside, Kip turned his head slightly. Not enough to look at her, but he knew she was there. The next morning she packed a small canvas satchel with dried meat, 2 pieces of fruit, and a length of leather cord. She didn't hand it to him. She just left it by the door. He didn't touch it that day. But that night, when she went to check, it was gone. She didn't replace it. The next morning, Kip walked to the same spot by the back fence. But instead of kneeling, he pressed his hand to the trunk of the large birch tree there, then stepped back. On the bark, barely visible in the morning mist, was a new mark. 3 small lines, 1 large one beneath them. Maggie traced it once with her finger. Walt arrived a little after and found her standing there. She didn't turn to him. She just said, "We were supposed to help, not keep." Walt nodded. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The forest didn't answer, but it didn't turn away either. And from the window behind them, Kip watched. Quiet as always. Not smiling, not afraid, just waiting for someone to make the right choice. In small towns, silence only lasts if no one profits from breaking it. By the time the ice melted completely from Moose Lake's shallow edges, the rumors had grown legs, a spine, and a camera-ready face. They started as murmurs, half-glances in the corner booth of Maggie's diner, smirks traded over gas station counters. But by the end of that week, someone had posted a flyer at the bait shop. Rare tracks in the woods. Camera club meetup. Cash prize for proof. Walt saw it first. He didn't tear it down. He didn't speak. He just stared at it like it had crawled out of a fire someone swore was out. The edges were damp from fog. Someone had printed it off a home machine. The ink was bleeding already, but the words had done their work. Proof. That was the bait. By nightfall, headlights started appearing at the edge of roads that hadn't seen tire marks in years. Big tires, long lenses. Men who didn't talk much but scanned every tree like it owed them something. It didn't take long for Maggie to notice. One morning she stepped out with a pail of wash water and spotted a drone hovering just past the tree line. It wasn't close enough to see details, but it wasn't far enough to ignore. By the time she set the pail down and walked back inside, it was gone. She didn't chase it. She just closed the blinds and pulled the old blackout curtain she kept for power outages. That same afternoon, someone knocked on her door. Not Walt, not Anya, not Colton. A man she didn't know, wearing a canvas vest too clean to be from the woods, holding a coffee he hadn't bought nearby. He smiled like he thought it would work. "Ma'am, I'm with Wildlife Sightings Monthly." "No, you're not," she said, and closed the door without letting the screen slam. She didn't say a word to Kip, who had gone still the moment the knock came. He sat cross-legged near the fireplace, back stiff, eyes watching the grain in the floor as if it might change direction. Later, when Walt arrived, she handed him the rifle from above the fireplace. He looked at her once. She didn't have to explain. Walt didn't go home that night. He stayed at the station, not as a guard, not to play hero, just to be there. Just in case being there meant someone else wouldn't be. And he saw it. Around 3 a.m., something moved past the tree line, too fast for any animal, too smooth to be coincidence. A flicker of shape, then another. People, at least 3. He didn't wake Maggie. He stepped outside alone and stood in the open clearing with both hands empty. No weapon, no flashlight. A spotlight hit his chest 2 seconds later. "Back inside, old man." Walt didn't move. "I'm not here for a fight," he said. "You're in the way." "That's the idea." A pause. Then one of the shapes whispered something too far off to make out. The light vanished. Leaves shifted. They were gone. Walt didn't sleep after that. By morning, footprints marked the edge of the field. 3 different pairs. No attempt to hide them. Like they didn't care who saw, as long as they weren't caught. Maggie brewed coffee and didn't ask questions. Kip didn't speak, but he stayed farther from the windows than before. And when Maggie moved toward him to adjust the blanket on his shoulders, he raised his hand, open-palmed, not to stop her, but to hold the space between them. Just for a breath. It was enough. She stepped back. Walt left after breakfast, but he didn't go straight home. He drove into town, parked on Main, walked into the bait shop. "Who's spreading this?" he asked. The kid behind the counter didn't look up. Walt leaned closer. "You know me. You know what I used to do for a living. I'm not here for fun." The kid swallowed hard. "Name's Hoyt Sandler. He's got a camp set up near Clearwater Bend. Says he's seen things. Wants proof." Walt nodded once. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He just walked out. That afternoon, the first shot was fired. Not at anyone. Into the air. Just a single crack of sound echoing across the south ridge, far enough to make the crows lift in one scattered black wave. Close enough that Kip flattened himself against the wall inside the station and covered his head with both arms. Not fear, not confusion. Recognition. That night, Maggie sat on the floor beside him and read from a book without pictures. She didn't expect him to understand the words. She just wanted him to hear the way her voice slowed at the sad parts. He didn't flinch, but he didn't look at her either. At dawn, Walt returned. He looked tired, but not from lack of sleep. "There's more than just cameras now," he said. "I saw traps." Maggie didn't speak. Walt opened his coat. Inside, a small device with a blinking red light. "Tracker. Found it stuck to my back bumper." She reached for it, but didn't touch it. "How long you think they've had it on you?" Walt stared out the window. "Long enough." They didn't need a meeting. They didn't need a plan. Walt drove west that evening with the tracker still blinking. He took the long road, past the lake, past the old fire station, past the old hunting camp where the roof had collapsed 2 winters ago and no one bothered to fix it. He parked there, then walked out on foot through the brush. Let them follow. It didn't matter. He wasn't going where they thought. He circled back in the dark, boots muffled in moss, coat zipped against the wind that picked up right around midnight. By the time he returned to Maggie's station, the tracker was blinking underwater in the beaver pond a mile north. The men never found him, but they weren't the ones who mattered most. The next morning, Walt stood outside the station while Maggie poured coffee inside. She paused at the sound of gravel shifting, then quiet again. When she stepped out, he was still staring into the trees. "They're getting closer," he said. "People?" "No," Walt said. "Them." He didn't point, but Maggie followed his gaze. In the distance, barely visible against the trunks, 3 pine branches had been broken. Not snapped, but folded downward and braided in a pattern. None of them were fresh. All of them were recent. She felt the weight of it without needing translation. Kip stepped onto the porch quietly. He saw the pattern. He didn't smile. He didn't react. But he did something he hadn't done before. He reached for Maggie's hand. Just once. Then let go. And turned back inside. That evening, Walt wrote something on a yellow pad. Folded it. Sealed it in plastic. Left it in a hollow log just off the west trail. Not a warning. A message. The next morning it was gone. The log was empty, but beside it, pressed into the mud, was a single shape. Not a footprint, a handprint. Massive, deep, still warm. Walt didn't tell Maggie right away. He didn't have to. Because when he got back to the station, Kip was waiting by the fire, arms crossed over his knees. And he looked at Walt, for the first time, with a kind of softness, like he knew what Walt had done, and why. The sun rose behind them, slow and golden, spilling through the kitchen window like it wanted to stay longer than it had. But the moment passed, because kindness didn't mean comfort. It meant knowing what was coming, and doing the hard thing anyway. The forest had gone quiet in a way that meant something was about to change. Not quiet like snowfall, not the hush of wind through pines. This was different, like the woods themselves had turned their faces away. Even the crows that usually circled around dawn stayed out of sight, and the ravine that always hummed with frogs had gone still. Maggie noticed first. She didn't say anything, just stood on the porch longer than usual that morning, one hand curled around a chipped coffee mug, eyes searching the tree line like it might offer an answer if she stared long enough. Inside, Kip hadn't eaten. The food was still there. Berries, oats, a strip of dried fish laid out like always, but untouched. He sat near the window, knees to chest, unmoving. He wasn't sick. His eyes were alert, breathing steady. But something in him had shifted, and Maggie knew, without needing to hear it, that this was the beginning of goodbye. That night, Anya arrived unexpectedly, her jacket dusted in pine needles, her breath visible in the air even though spring had already pushed past the edges of winter. She didn't knock, just stepped inside and shut the door behind her with care. "I think they're calling him back," she said quietly. Maggie didn't turn. She knew, but it wasn't just instinct now. It was fact. Anya pulled something from her coat pocket, an old, weathered scrap of bark, thin but firm, with a series of carved notches along the edge. Maggie took it in silence, running her thumb over the grooves. "Same pattern we saw by Clearwater Bend," Anya said. "Except this time it was left under the porch beam, right beneath the nail where you hang your lantern." Walt arrived soon after, and Anya showed it again. He stared at it for a long while before speaking. "That's a time mark," he said. "Old way of counting days. I've seen similar ones near wolf dens, but this one," he turned it in his hand. "This one's counting down." Outside, the wind picked up, low and restless, shifting the branches just enough to rattle the loose eaves. Maggie didn't flinch. She just leaned against the wall, staring past Kip, who still hadn't moved. "I think they're giving us a deadline," she said. Walt didn't argue. Anya sat down slowly at the edge of the table and exhaled through her nose. Then said it aloud. "It's the law, isn't it?" Maggie nodded. "Law of return," Walt added. "Trade, gift, rescue, doesn't matter. Nothing in their world is taken without a plan to give it back." "And if we don't?" Anya asked. Walt didn't answer, but Kip did. He stood, quietly, steadily, like he'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. And then he walked to the corner near the woodpile where his old satchel sat, the one Maggie had packed weeks ago, left by the door. He lifted it, still light, and carried it to the center of the room. He didn't speak, didn't gesture. He just placed it down, then looked at each of them, one by one, and for the first time since the lake, he made a sound. Not loud, not a word, just a low, breathy tone from deep in the throat. It wasn't pain. It wasn't fear. It was permission. Maggie felt something break under her ribs. She turned away. Outside, the wind slammed once against the side of the cabin, then went still. That night they didn't speak much. Walt sharpened his old hunting knife out of habit, then put it away without reason. Anya paced once around the perimeter, then took her post near the back porch, and Maggie sat beside Kip in the low light, holding nothing in her hands for the first time in weeks. When she woke the next morning, Kip was already outside. He stood barefoot in the grass, the dew clinging to his legs, eyes locked east toward the ridge where the pines grew in a tight spiral. Maggie opened the door slowly and stepped out beside him. She didn't touch him, just watched where he watched. And then they saw it. Not movement, not sound. Just a single piece of carved wood resting upright on a stone outcrop near the tree line. It hadn't been there the night before. It was smooth, with dark grooves running across the top. The same symbol as the bark piece, only deeper. Final. Kip didn't move toward it, but his breath caught in his chest. Maggie heard it, soft and sudden. He knew. Later that day, a slip of paper arrived at the diner back in town. No return address. Just a folded napkin with 6 words scrawled in uneven ballpoint ink. "I know what's in your station." No signature, just that. Walt read it twice, then folded it, tucked it into his shirt pocket without a word. When he got back to the cabin, Kip was drawing again. Mud this time, on the side of the shed. Lines thick and straight, then arched, then twisted inward like a spiral. Maggie froze when she saw it. She recognized the pattern. It was the same image etched in charcoal weeks ago on the hearthstone. The big figure, the small one, the path between them. Except now there was a third, a figure standing off to the side, watching, not part of the path. She didn't ask who it was meant to be. She already knew. That night Kip didn't eat again, but he drank from the basin near the back wall, then walked to the door. He didn't open it. He just stood there, waiting. Walt placed a hand on the doorknob, then stopped. "He's not running," he said. "He's waiting for us to let him." The weight of that truth fell over the room like a blanket soaked in storm water. Maggie stepped forward. Her voice didn't shake. "I've been holding him here, not helping him, not anymore." Anya looked at the clock. 2 days left. The next morning Kip wasn't at the door. He was in the clearing, staring at something none of them could see. His posture was still, not tense, but resolute. When Maggie called gently to him, he didn't turn. Just placed one hand to the ground, held it there, and then stood again. That evening, Maggie found something she hadn't noticed before. On the windowsill above the kitchen sink, a small pile of stones stacked deliberately, with a single feather tucked between the top 2. It hadn't come from the wind. Kip had left it there. A thank you, or a reminder, or both. That night, none of them slept. They sat by the fire until it dimmed. Outside, the forest pulsed with something they couldn't name, and when dawn finally cracked across the edge of the lake, the sound that came with it was not human, not threat, not sorrow, but a rhythm. 3 soft, hollow knocks, then silence, then 3 more, and Kip stood, picked up the satchel, and without needing a single word spoken between them, walked toward the door. The night they chose to return, Kip was colder than it should have been. The forecast had promised mild spring wind, maybe a little fog rolling in from the lake. But as the sky dimmed to that slate blue-gray and the birds stopped singing early, it became clear something older than weather was moving through the woods. The temperature dropped, the pines stiffened, and every living thing that usually spoke after dark held its breath like it knew this night didn't belong to them. Inside the station, no one said much. The plan wasn't written on paper, but every soul in the room knew their part. Maggie packed the satchel with care. Jerky, a folded cloth, the small figurine Kip had carved from driftwood and left under his cot without a word. Walt cleaned the lantern glass. Anya double-checked the flashlight batteries, then turned them off again. There would be no light where they were going. Not the kind they could carry, anyway. Kip sat near the open door, his legs folded beneath him. He hadn't eaten since yesterday, but his eyes were clear, not glassy or fearful, just steady, watching the tree line the way someone waits for a voice they haven't heard in a long time. His breathing matched the wind, in, out, like he knew it wouldn't be long now. The time came around 4 a.m., still black outside, but not silent anymore. They heard movement, branches brushing, not snapping, something walking not toward them, but around them. The way you move when you're drawing a circle you don't intend to cross. Walt stepped out first, the rifle strapped to his back but untouched. He didn't light the lantern, just waited for the rest. Anya opened the gate. Maggie followed, her hands empty, and Kip stood. No resistance, no goodbye, just a quiet acceptance. He pulled the satchel strap over one shoulder, looked at the cabin once, then walked out barefoot into the frost-covered grass without flinching. They didn't head for the lake. They went south, through the grove with the 3 marked trees, through the fallen log where the handprint had been left 2 nights before, and down the narrow ridge path that Kip had stopped near every dusk. The air shifted halfway down. A smell, wet bark, earth, Something like old moss and stone warmed by skin. Not animal, not weather. Something breathing, watching. They reached the clearing just before dawn. It wasn't large. Just enough space for the trees to step back, for the sky to spill down like a veil. At the center, a boulder flat and wide like an altar without history. It looked natural, but they all knew better. This place had been chosen. The first sound came from behind them. A thud, not a footfall. Then another, from the opposite side. They didn't turn, and then Kip stepped forward. 3 paces past the circle. He stopped, laid his satchel on the rock, and waited. A branch cracked, soft but deliberate. Maggie turned slightly, and that's when she saw them. Tall shapes, unmoving. Not hidden, not charging, just there. 15, maybe 20. No two the same height. Shoulders like trunks, faces in shadow. Fur thick with forest debris. Eyes catching no light but seeming to glow anyway. Some crouched, some stood. One leaned forward, arms bent in a way that looked like grief or prayer. None of them spoke, and yet the woods were humming. The feeling wasn't fear, it was all sharpened into warning. No one moved. Then someone did. Behind Maggie, a voice cracked the air like a twig snapped in a church. "Hey!" Flashlight beam cut the dark, high and swinging. "Hey, over here!" A man's voice, not local, thin with greed. Then a second light flared from the ridge above. They'd been followed. Walt stepped forward instantly, shielding Kip with one arm. "Stay down!" he called, low but firm. The forest groaned. Every shape shifted forward half a step. Not toward Kip, toward the threat. Anya turned and drew her sidearm. Not raised, but ready. Her breath fogged in quick pulses. "Back off," she said to the trees behind them. But the men didn't stop. More footsteps, gravel, something metallic clicking, and then the forest stopped breathing. Maggie felt it before she heard it. That terrifying sacred stillness. Not man-made, not enforced, just chosen. Like every root and leaf had agreed. No more sound. Then Kip moved. He stepped away from the rock. Not toward the creatures. Toward the humans. But not the ones protecting him. He walked toward the flashlight beam. No fear, no panic, just choice. And the beam dropped. Not from violence, from awe. The man holding it backed away, shaking his head. The second man tried to lift a camera. His hands froze mid-motion. Not from cold. Something had shifted again. From the forest edge, one of the tall figures stepped fully into view. Broad-chested, taller than the others. Gray streaks through its fur, eyes dark and wide. It raised one hand, not to threaten, to signal. Kip stopped, turned to Maggie, and this time he held her gaze, longer than he ever had. Then he looked at Walt. A pause, then a single deliberate blink, as if saying, "I know what you gave up." And then he turned, not toward the figure that had signaled, but beside it, past it, into the forest's throat. One by one the shapes began to step back. No sound, no footsteps, just disappearance into shadow. By the time the sun cracked low over the trees, only the 4 humans remained, and silence returned. But it was different now. Not the kind of silence you get from fear. The kind you earn. Anya holstered her weapon. Maggie wiped her cheek once, not realizing a tear had fallen. Walt lowered his shoulders and looked at the ridge. No sign of the men. Not anymore. Only the woods. Only that open clearing, and the flat rock where a satchel no longer sat. They waited a few minutes longer, then turned back. The path behind them was quiet, but not empty, and the feeling that followed them home wasn't sadness. It was something older, something like understanding, but not quite peace. The sun came up like it didn't know what had just happened. Soft, pale, unbothered. It stretched across the pines and slid down the roofs of Moose Lake without any sense of urgency, brushing frost from the eaves and melting it back into morning like nothing had shifted. But inside the station and deep in the woods behind it, everyone knew something had. Kip was gone. The cot was still warm, but empty. The satchel, too. Maggie hadn't touched it. She didn't fold the blanket, didn't open the windows. The silence inside wasn't empty. It was full of the kind of stillness that only comes after a door's been shut softly and no one gets up to open it again. She sat at the small table by the stove, a half cup of coffee gone cold in her hand, staring out toward the clearing. Her back ached the way it always did when she hadn't slept, but she hadn't even noticed. Walt came in an hour later. He didn't ask where Kip had gone. He didn't need to. His boots left damp prints across the threshold, and he set his hat on the hook the same way he had for 20 years. But he didn't take his coat off. "They're gone," he said quietly. Maggie nodded once. "Not just gone, gone," he added. There were no tracks this time, no broken branches, no overturned moss, no proof. It was better that way. At the edge of town, Hoyt Sandler's camp was abandoned by midday. The men who had hunted a photograph, a scream, a payday, they scattered. Maybe it was the silence that finally reached them. Maybe it was the way the birds had returned to the woods, but the wind hadn't. Or maybe it was something else, something they couldn't explain, something that stared back when they thought they were alone. One man left behind a trail camera strapped to a cedar near the ridge. Maggie found it during a walk later that week. The batteries had been drained. The memory card wiped clean. She brought it back, left it on the porch railing. By the next morning it was gone too, and in its place, a small stack of twigs arranged in a spiral, wrapped once with a single red thread. She didn't ask Walt about it. She didn't need to. The forest was cleaning up after itself. The station returned to normal, or something close to it. The lantern got cleaned. The radio static returned. Anya came by less often, but always left with quiet eyes and longer hugs. Maggie's old routines came back in slow pieces, feeding the foxes down near the creek, sorting herbs in jars that hadn't been labeled since last winter. But none of it felt the same. Not worse, just different. One night, just after the moon had waxed full and begun to wane again, Maggie woke in the middle of the night with her heart racing and her hands shaking. She didn't know why at first. Just a feeling. Like someone had said her name without speaking it. Like something important was happening somewhere not far away. She lit the lamp, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, walked barefoot to the porch, and there, at the edge of the clearing, where the grass met the edge of the woods, two shapes. She didn't blink. One tall, one smaller. Neither moved. The moonlight was just enough. She didn't need to see faces. She knew. The smaller shape stepped forward slightly, bent low, pressed a hand against the earth, slowly, gently, then stood again. Then both figures faded back into the trees. She stayed there until dawn. The next day, she didn't tell Walt. But when she went to the spot where the hand had touched down, the grass there was still damp, even though the rest of the clearing was dry. It hadn't rained. She kneeled, pressed her own hand to the same place, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I know." Later that month, Walt got a call from a man who used to work in the county clerk's office. Said someone had gone through old wildlife files. Not copies, originals, film reels, hand-drawn maps, handwritten reports from the 70s and 80s that had gone untouched for decades. And one was missing. A report from 1989 detailing an unconfirmed sighting near Moose Lake. The man said it like a confession. Walt thanked him, then hung up. He didn't go looking. Some stories deserve to disappear when they're done being useful. In early May, Maggie found a new boundary marker near the southern trail. Not bark this time. A line of stones, 3 across, one at each end, taller and darker. Not a warning, not a barrier, a welcome. She stared at it for a long time, then stepped past it. No shadows moved, no breath caught. She just walked until she reached the fallen birch Kip used to sit near. Sat on the same rock, and waited. Nothing came, but the quiet felt like acknowledgement, not goodbye, just space. That summer, tourists came through more often. The trails reopened. The ranger trucks rumbled by again with fresh paint and younger faces. But the station remained untouched. Somehow, it had slipped between notice and nostalgia. People passed it like they knew better than to ask if it still worked. Like they'd agreed to leave it alone. In town, no one talked about Kip. But they did ask about Maggie more often. Said she looked lighter. said she smiled more. They didn't see the way her hands would rest on the windowsill in the evenings. Fingers curled slightly like she was holding a memory that hadn't faded yet. They didn't see the way she still paused before stepping into the woods, or the way she sometimes left an extra portion of food near the edge of the tree line. Not out of habit, out of respect. In September, the first frost came early. One morning, Walt showed up with a new stack of firewood and didn't leave after breakfast. He just sat on the back steps, staring out. After a while, he pulled something from his pocket. A folded photo, faded at the corners. Not of Kip, but of Walt himself, maybe 30 years younger, kneeling beside an overturned canoe. A boy standing behind him, grinning, mud on his face. Walt held it a long time, then handed it to Maggie. "That's the last time I thought I saved someone," he said. She didn't answer. He didn't need her to. That night, she tucked the photo behind the old mirror above the wash basin. Didn't hide it, just gave it a place to stay. The days got shorter, the wind came colder, and one morning, just before snow dusted the ridge for the first time, Maggie stepped outside and saw a new mark carved into the post by the porch. Fresh, clean, 3 lines. One curved beneath them, like a cradle. She didn't touch it. She just smiled. And left the door open a little longer that day, because some things don't need to stay forever to matter. Some things just need to be seen, held, and let go when they ask. And if you're quiet long enough, they'll find their way back, even if it's only for a moment, even if it's only to remind you, you did the right thing. Sometimes, the things we carry aren't ours to keep. They find us in the quiet, in the cracks of ordinary days, wounded, misplaced, wordless, and for a moment, we're asked not to solve them, but simply to hold them, to listen, to guard what cannot speak. That is the measure of something ancient in us, something beyond instinct or law. The willingness to care without reward, to protect without ownership, to give without expecting anything in return. The world does not always recognize the weight of that kindness. It rarely thanks us for the choices made in silence. And yet, those choices shape us. The decision to open a door instead of locking it, to walk toward mystery rather than away from it, to let go, not because we stopped loving, but because love demanded we step aside. In a world hungry for answers, proof, spectacle, there's still power in restraint. There's a kind of sacredness in honoring the unknown, in allowing a creature, a memory, a truth to exist without having to belong to us. Some stories were never meant to be held under glass or told in full. Some are whispered through the trees, passed hand to hand in symbols older than language, offered only to those willing to listen without claiming. And perhaps the deepest kind of connection is not forged in permanence, but in the willingness to part. In knowing when to step back so something wild can remain wild. When to stop asking what it means and instead just witness it, fully, fiercely, with our whole heart. The forest has its own memory, its own justice, its own way of balancing what we call right and wrong. But it also remembers mercy. It remembers the warmth of a single hand reaching out, even if only once. And sometimes that is enough. Sometimes we're not meant to be heroes. We're just meant to be there. Thank you for walking with us through this story. If it stirred something in you, if it reminded you of something you've let go of, or something you still hope to protect, tell us. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. And if you'd like to keep walking these quiet, untamed paths with us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have more stories to tell, and some doors, once opened, never truly close.